This is the English on Air podcast where we interview interesting guests and teach English at the same time. This is the second part of the interview with Norman Mounter. What about language? Because I know you've got a real interest in language as well.
Yeah, I think that stems from much later on. I mean, when I was at school, I loved English. I loved creative writing. I loved reading English, but we were never really taught what I would call the discipline of grammar, of, rhetoric, all of those kind of old school subjects, those old grammar school subjects where you'd have to learn about proper use of grammar. And that's something that I've had to pick up on my own. But actually, it's a fascinating area because you really start to learn the power of how you can use English to be basically most effective in what you want to say. And it's often the case that you don't need a lot of words. You just need the right choice of word in an appropriate style that obviously suits you and also is easy to read. And grammar gives you that. Grammar has many other elements to it apart from spelling and punctuation and things. And one of the things that really interests me is the word history. So understanding where a word has come from, whether it be, particularly in English, whether it be through the Latin, from the Romans or the Anglo-Saxon, or, even the kind of Celtic derivation. But that's always been fascinating to me. And I think that partly comes from my passion for Tolkien. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, Tolkien's Legendarium is very much based on a mythology that has strong links with language. You can look at any character or word in Tolkien and there will be an underlying etymology to that word. He doesn't just pluck them out of air. And don't forget, this is a professor of Anglo-Saxon that actually invented his own languages. He invented Elvish, for example. So that influence on me cannot be understated because he was, and still is, to be honest, a massive influence on my life.
Right, so we've sort of touched on your special interest, let's say, because I know you're interested in lots of things. It's not just those three things, but that's related to the new book that's coming out. You have your book. It's not your first book, but you've been working on this book for a while, and I thought you could tell the story, where this story came from. What is the story of the new book?
The new book is, as you quite rightly say, it is a fusion of all of these passions of mine, the English, the writing, the history, but also the medicine. It really stems from a period of my life where I was reading a lot about the Third Reich and the Nazis, and particularly the Holocaust, and I began to delve into a lot of Holocaust literature, particularly first-hand accounts of people that have survived the camps, and really created a huge mark on me. I began to feel more and more hurt by it, and in a way, particularly because prior to this point, no one had really ever told me about it. I was never taught about this at school, for example, and I remember seeing Schindler's List in 1994 and being very moved by that. But since then, I've constantly been interested in this part of what I would call modern history, and at that point, I can recall, giving you a message saying, John, I've got this idea, it's coming out of me, I'm going to start off on this Holocaust train and I'm going to just see where it sort of leads me. And the book in that sense just flowed out of me, probably only taking me about 3 months to write, if that, and it literally just flowed out. It wasn't in any order, but what it did do for me, it was a kind of purge, it was a catharsis of all of this stuff that had built up inside me over the years of research, and it did help me come to terms with some of the stuff I'd written, but it also enabled me to, particularly in the context of my medical training, to get inside the head of my main character. My main character is called Dr. Josef Sarkany, and he is based on a real-life pathologist from Hungary whose name was Miklos Nyszly, and he wrote a book just after the war called Auschwitz, an eyewitness doctor's account, and he talks about his time working in the crematorium for the infamous Josef Mengele, who had built within the main crematorium his own laboratory, his own post-mortem room for what I would only describe as pseudo-scientific kind of experiments. So again, it was this idea of looking at the medical and the pathological aspects of this man, and also what was going on at this time in Germany, this great nation of scientists and of music and literature, this fantastically civilized nation. How could it have regressed to a state where you have doctors, nurses, scientists saying, well, it's okay to kill people under euthanasia if they've got mental illness or they're handicapped. It's okay to do it. And then, of course, it got worse. It started to go from the euthanasia centres into the wider aspects of ethnic cleansing once Hitler had started his war and was basically taking countries like Poland and other Eastern European countries who were deemed to be subhuman, the Untermenschen. He used this as an excuse to not only kill them but also experiment on them as well. So you have this horrible concentration of people in these camps like Auschwitz that are Jewish, but also you have Romani people, you have Poles, Czechs, all these other people that were considered to be basically subhuman being killed or tortured or experimented on. So for me this was a terrible realisation, and I still really can't get to terms with it, how the medical profession could have sunk so low during that period of time. And it wasn't just in Germany, I must say. The concept of eugenics, this idea of a master race, was as much in the world of the American literature as it was in European literature. But of course what happened was that Hitler used these doctrines, all these ideas like eugenics, and then twisted them and did terrible, terrible things based on these, what I would call spurious doctrines or pseudo-scientific doctrines, in order to progress his own megalomania, an idea of this master race, this Aryan race that he wanted to basically have in a brand new Europe. So Broken Nose has many themes running through it, but I think one of the main things for me is this idea of how could this have ever happened, and how could it have ever happened in the context of the people that were perpetrating it, the doctors and nurses.
It seems it germinated into something that you needed some kind of vent or outpouring, and the way you seem to do it, Norm, is on paper. You seem to start writing. It seems, if we go back to when we were 10 or even pre-10, you said earlier that it was this kind of, making sense of the world, getting it all out and putting it down on paper. And that's what was happening. It seems like you still do it. It doesn't surprise me that Sarkany, the lead character of the book, you thought about the name means something in ancient Greek, you were saying. That's very Tolkien, what you were saying about Tolkien. Or every character, every word seemed to have relate back to another language.
I based this name on the term sark or sarx in Greek, which is basically meaning flesh or body. And Sarkany, for me, the word embodied this idea of him as a pathologist, working with flesh, working with the bodies. That was his kind of craft. And similarly, in a way, that's what I do as well. I work with tissue. I am a histopathologist, and I look at the diseases of tissue through my eyes, through the naked eye, but also under the microscope. And in a way, Broken Nose is looking at this man with my own knowledge of pathology and looking at how he deals with these situations and how he talks about dealing with these situations, particularly when he's doing his autopsy work on twins, and he starts to realise that his twins have been murdered. Mengele had injected them in the heart with phenol or some other poison. And it's just, for me, the book was easier to write because I could at least understand what he was talking about from the point of view of the pathology and the medicine. And I think that gives the book an edge for me, because it's not just me as a writer writing a piece of fiction. I do have experience in this area.